The Seminole Wars, a series of brutal conflicts spanning from 1817 to 1858, remains some of the most complex and drawn-out conflicts in American history. The wars were driven by territorial disputes, economic interests, racial prejudices, and a complex mix of American expansionism, native sovereignty, and the simmering tensions surrounding slavery. These wars weren't merely battles of attrition over land, but also symbolized the lengths to which both the U.S. government and the Seminole people would go to assert their sovereignty and their way of life. The Seminole Wars are often divided into three primary conflicts, but this delineation does little to capture the continuity and nuances of this prolonged struggle. The origins of the Seminole people were themselves shaped by resistance. Seminoles were composed of various indigenous groups, primarily Creek, who fled southward into Florida to escape colonial pressure in Georgia and Alabama. They intermarried with runaway African slaves, many of whom were seeking refuge from the brutal conditions on southern plantations. By the late 1700s, the Seminole people had established a distinct identity, one that was fiercely independent and defiant against the encroaching influence of European settlers. As tensions grew between the United States and Spain over Florida, and as the U.S. government increasingly viewed the presence of African Americans among the Seminole as a threat, conflict became inevitable. The U.S. government could not ignore the presence of an indigenous people it saw as rebellious and dangerous within a critical and resource-rich region. The First Seminole War, which erupted in 1817, began with a chain of events that were both strategic and tragically unavoidable. Under the command of General Andrew Jackson, American forces invaded Spanish-controlled Florida with the aim of suppressing the Seminole threat and ending what the U.S. perceived as a haven for runaway slaves. The spark was the murder of an American soldier, an act that Jackson seized upon as a pretext for military action. His troops destroyed Seminole villages, attacked Spanish forts, and displayed no restraint in subduing the Seminole and their allies. The brutality of this invasion marked a troubling precedent, highlighting the ferocity with which the U.S. government was willing to expand its influence and the harsh consequences for those who stood in its way. Jackson's success in the First Seminole War helped to cement his reputation as a tenacious leader and ultimately pave the way for the acquisition of Florida by the United States in 1821. However, the conclusion of the First Seminole War did not bring peace to the region. As American settlers moved southward and the United States sought to solidify its control over Florida, the Seminole people were pushed into increasingly confined territories. By the 1830s, the federal government had embarked on a campaign of forced relocation known as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which aimed to move all Native American tribes in the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi River. For the Seminole, who had long established roots in Florida, this policy was unacceptable. Their resistance to relocation would spark the Second Seminole War, the longest and most expensive Indian conflict in U.S. history. The Second Seminole War, beginning in 1835, was an extended and devastating conflict characterized by guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and a relentless series of battles in the dense swamps and forests of Florida. Led by the charismatic and skillful war chief Osceola, the Seminole warriors knew their land intimately, using the landscape to their advantage against the American forces. Osceola became a symbol of resistance, inspiring both his people and African Americans who had joined the Seminole ranks. His capture in 1837 under a flag of truce was a shock to the Seminole and remains a tragic episode in American history. Despite Osceola's imprisonment and subsequent death, the Seminole did not surrender. They continued to resist under other leaders, evading the U.S. military through the wilderness, enduring incredible hardships, and continuing to pose a significant threat to the U.S. forces. The U.S. government's efforts to subdue the Seminole were unyielding, with thousands of troops, millions of dollars, and countless resources dedicated to the campaign. However, the Seminoles' knowledge of the terrain, combined with their resilience and refusal to accept defeat, made the war a protracted and costly endeavor. While many Seminoles were eventually captured and forced westward, a small group evaded capture and remained in the Florida wilderness. The conflict dragged on for 7 years, with each side experiencing heavy losses and the American public growing weary of a war with no clear end in sight. The U.S. government eventually offered land grants and promises of safe passage to those Seminole who agreed to relocate west, though a small, unyielding faction refused, choosing to remain in their homeland at any cost. The Third Seminole War, which began in 1855, marked the last major conflict between the Seminole and the U.S. government. By this time, the Seminole population in Florida had been decimated, their numbers reduced to a small, tight-knit group hiding deep in the Everglades. The war was precipitated by the expansionist activities of white settlers who continued to encroach upon Seminole land, provoking skirmishes and acts of violence. The U.S. government, determined to eliminate any remaining native presence in Florida, launched another series of military campaigns. However, the Third Seminole War lacked the intensity and scale of the previous conflicts. By this point, the Seminole resistance had become a symbolic fight, a demonstration of their enduring spirit and refusal to surrender their land and way of life. In 1858, the U.S. government ended the conflict, granting land rights to the remaining Seminole in exchange for a cessation of hostilities. The legacy of the Seminole Wars is one of resilience, adaptation, and survival against overwhelming odds. These wars serve as a powerful reminder of the U.S. government's aggressive policies of expansion and the devastating impact they had on indigenous communities. The Seminole people, through their alliances, military strategies, and determination to preserve their freedom, were able to resist for more than 4 decades, a feat unmatched by any other indigenous group in the United States. Their struggle exemplifies the larger tragedy of Native American resistance to colonial expansion, a theme that resonates deeply within American history.